So this study was really involved, and there could be quite a lot of different places to choose to start dealing with the materials contained herein, but I think given some of the feedback that I've gotten, the right place would be to start with the question, what exactly is a consent violation, right? So this was an issue all the way back at the very beginning as we were trying to design the survey instrument. There was a lot of concern about not being too particular in defining it one particular way or another, and I had entered the suggestion of offering a free response section on the survey so that people could write in their own, but it was pointed out that it would be very difficult and maybe even impossible to do any sort of statistical comparison of such a thing. And the reason for that is that there's really two different kinds of a definition, right, that exist. You have a theoretical definition, and a theoretical definition is about abstracts. It's about what something is conceptually, and it is something that is added to and changed and modified as any particular field of study grows, and it's expected to. That's why you have them. That's why we have study process. That's what that's for. But you also need to have such a thing as an operational definition. And an operational definition is it judges a phenomenon by specific measurable qualities, right? And it also must, in any given instance, it must have a quality that is falsifiable, right? So we would have to be able to prove it wrong if it were not so, just like it in science. So there wasn't any test for that on the original survey instrument, but that was part of the reason why we ran the temperature check survey, which was a much shorter survey, didn't collect anywhere near as much demographic data, but it was really very targeted. We already knew kind of what we were trying to verify based on the responses that had already been received. This was to check the data that we were getting and to make sure that it really was what it looked like. So to test for this, we made it very simple. We just said a consent violation occurs when ... And there's three options based on how organizers actually respond and how they actually treat it when something is reported to them, and whether or not they consider it to be a violation. Whether or not, in other words, you might be punished for doing it. Because that's the real question, isn't it? And there's really three different such definitions currently operating within the community. And I would just like to put the disclaimer on here for the sake of covering my own Batutsky, that I don't have any legal credentials, and none of this constitutes legal advice, and this information is being presented for educational purposes only. But we are calling the first definition the legal definition. This would be what we all have come to understand and expect about how we're going to be treated by the law under different sorts of circumstances if we were to go to report something. And while these are, there's a broad network of different consent laws out there depending on your locality and everything else, but the core of it, the thing that remains the same regardless, is and this is how it was worded on the study, was a consent violation occurs when someone tells you no and you don't stop, or you do it anyway, or when the person is clearly incapable of saying no. Right? So that's the common sense definition of rape, essentially. So the totals for this were actually the highest of all of the available options given. 45.16% of responders agreed with that statement. The breakdown was 42.86% of men, 48.39% of women, and 40% of non-binary and no response individuals. From now on, we'll just call them non-binary individuals. So, you know, that's fairly similar rates there, it seems to be. But that's still just slightly under half, so it's the plurality. However, there are significant issues with the other two runners-up. And we'll go through them. You know, I don't want to rip these entirely apart because they do have their place. There's certainly, you know, places where these are the appropriate models to use. The question is, are these the appropriate models to use in a recreational sexual environment? And that's really what we're going for here. And the next one down is affirmative consent. And the way we defined affirmative consent there in the study was a consent violation occurs when a verbal yes is not obtained for each touch activity engaged by all parties, right? Because remember, an operational definition has got to be falsifiable. So if it ever isn't true, then that would be a reason to dismiss that as a possible operational definition. So for the affirmative, that's 23.81% from men, 38.71% from women, 30% from non-binary individuals, and 32.26% overall. And I would like to note that in the beliefs section of this survey, the one and only statement that achieved 100% agreement from everyone was that there are some touch activities where you don't need to ask to do every little thing. That's the only thing we agreed on. So there's that for a start. Now, like I said, there are appropriate occasions to use affirmative consent, and let's talk about what it really is and where it came from before we dismiss it out of hand. So, affirmative consent is the idea that as you're engaging a partner sexually, the thing to do is to make sure that you have verbally gotten consent from them for each step of the way that you are proceeding along a sexual experience. Now, where difficulties arise with this is that not everybody has the same levels in their mind for what represents an advancement of the sexual experience. And furthermore, full affirmative consent, like if you were to fully apply this doctrine, not only would someone have to ask you, may I touch your arm, right? But then you would have to ask before they touched your arm, is it okay if I purr when you do it? Right? So you would have to clear your response that you're going to have to what they're going to do to you before they do it. Otherwise, you haven't engaged in affirmative consent with them, and now there's been a consent violation. So this is a very kind of technical system, right? And why is it that way? Well, we have to look back at the origins of affirmative consent and where it came from. Obviously, we have to put it in its context. And the first known example of this being instituted somewhere was Antioch College in 92, and it was a an effort created by a group called the Women of Antioch, spelled with a Y. And it's clear if you read the original document. First off, it's a testament to the work that these young activists did. Absolutely, no question, good work them. But it's clear if you read the whole document that they were addressing a situation on campus where drug use and probably wild partying was the standard affair. And that also we were dealing with an extremely sexually adventurous population. And we can tell by noting that some of the protocols mention tools and toys. So that would tend to indicate that these people were also engaging in BDSM. Now, if you mix drugs and BDSM, that's your choice, but that does make matters much more difficult in being certain about consent. And it's understandable in that environment why these activists would want to insist upon verbal consent as the baseline of interaction, especially considering that you're dealing with a student population and these people have not had that much experience. They're being very suddenly put into a new situation that they've never dealt with before, and a lot of them probably didn't have much, if any, experience prior to coming to the college with what this meant. And so you're dealing with an uneducated population trying things out that they don't know while on drugs. Okay. And also there appeared to be some significant concern around STIs as well at the time. And now, in that circumstance, under those parameters, it's absolutely understandable why you would want to insist on a system of ensuring verbal consent at every advancement level. But there were problems with this, even at the time, and quite a lot of what was in the original document has not made it into subsequent models. Things that I would say were actually integral to what made this original effort sound. And part of that included very clear, very direct and specific guidance around what kinds of enforcement would occur depending on what kind of breach was reported. And we aren't seeing that in new affirmative consent models. That's just not actually a part of what's included, right? So you take the thing, you take the whole activist model, break it apart, and pick out just a few of the pieces of that and take it out of its context and try to apply it someplace else. And of course, it's not going to work as hoped for. Now, the other place that affirmative consent makes a lot of sense is in an educational environment, right? So if you're in a workshop, this is kind of what you need to do in order to CYA as a facilitator, to prevent any sort of backlash on you, because if there's any question about it, then obviously affirmative consent wasn't followed, and you can just, throw the person out. No, nobody's going to argue with that, because somebody was watching, and, it happened in an environment where there were witnesses around to see and, give testimony about what they saw happen and all of those other things. But none of that is true back in your own bedroom, back in your own tent, back in your own hotel room. And nor do most of us particularly want to have to ask for each individual activity. And in practice, the reality is, I don't see this model used, even by the people who teach it, outside of a classroom setting. If they use anything like it, what they actually use is landmarks. And landmarks is a much better idea. Landmarks requires that at the beginning of the session, whatever it is you're engaging with your partner, that you define what specifically are the acts that you would need your partner to make a verbal request about before you engaged in those activities. And the reason for this is very simple. Everybody's bases are not loaded the same. Okay? And in the middle of sex is a horrible time to be playing who's on first. And if you do choose to use a system of landmarks, the more landmarks your partner asks for, the easier it becomes to maybe accidentally screw up and forget one. So if you are going to use landmarks, try to keep them, as few as possible. And, for the sake of your partner, and so that you can actually enjoy the experience rather than being worried the whole time. But do set them if you want them. Because if we know that 100% of people agreed that sometimes you don't need to use affirmative consent, you don't know for sure whether or not your partner thinks this is one of that times if you don't say. So, at a basic level, if you need something, ask for it. Just trust that if you want some kind of a modification and, your partner is there with you in that moment, that they are going to actually want to fulfill those desires for you. And be clear in your communication about what exactly it is you need asked about before it happens, right? So take responsibility for yourself and let your partner know. And if we were to do that, if we did use a system like that, if, those who need affirmative consent for their own comfort were to engage with that, then I would say a large portion of these, conflicts would just vanish. They would just vanish. So yeah, affirmative consent, it definitely has its place. The one that is of real concern, to me at least, is this idea of the felt definition of consent. And this is how it reads. A consent violation occurs when the person you are sharing touch with doesn't actually want the touch that is happening, whether they say so or not. All right. So what this one is really about is whether or not you can decide after the fact that you didn't want to have the sex you had. And this is known now in the literature as retroactive revocation of consent, right? Now, I want to be clear that when people are engaged in this practice, they don't think of that as what they're doing. They've actually been trained with this definition in mind to consider themselves to be victims who've only just now realized it. And in some cases, that may well be true. But in other cases, it may just as likely be true that if they would have used their no, then their partner would have immediately stopped. And that's really the question is, is a sexual violation, that word violation, is it something you can do by accident? Because either we've got a highly technical form like full affirmative consent where you can make a technical breach even if nobody was actually harmed. Versus this felt definition where even if you didn't say no, even if you didn't use any, the appropriate technical consent protocols at the time, you can decide after the fact that you didn't want it, and therefore it was a consent violation. And since it's, feelings are inside, they're internal, there can be no argument. Right? There's nothing but self-reporting around feelings. So that means that, people who subscribe to this, if you look at what happened and you say, well, this didn't actually violate the rules that we have, they're going to get pretty upset. And that does happen. And so in this felt definition, where this is coming from, firstly, we have the etymology question, and they'll tell you that consent, consent, means to feel with. Now, with, we got that. We're not arguing that, but sent is the Latin root sentio, is what they're arguing means to feel. And anybody who knows anything about Latin knows that there are very few words in the language, and a lot of them are made to do double duty all over the place. And that's the case with this word. And, I'm not going to go into the whole spiel, but part of it is that the main part is that at the time, the people who used that language did not actually make a distinction between the part of the self that emotes and the part of the self that thinks. That's a modern invention. They didn't believe that, and that is why there's so many different possible English interpretations of the word, is because we do make distinctions between these states. And so from the perspective of a Latin speaker, there wasn't actually any difference between the concepts of to think, to feel, to believe. All right. So what we're really looking at here is, would a rational person, looking at the situation presented to them, believe that they were achieving consent with their partner? So, and how would you know otherwise? Well, they'd have to tell you. They'd have to pull away from your touch. They would be unresponsive to touch that you would expect to be physically pleasing. Any of those things, they would have to actually give an indicator, whether verbal or nonverbal, that they weren't interested. If they're not doing those things, well, then a reasonable person would assess that they had consent. And it is not fair to expect your partner to read your mind. I don't want my partners to expect me to read their minds. I want them to tell me if, whatever is happening isn't what they want. And I want the same kind of reciprocal adult relationship that any of us wants. We all need to take responsibility for our own consent. And that is the trouble with this felt definition, is that it essentially allows people to abdicate personal accountability in these matters. And the other part about this that's really interesting is that it was actually the lowest of the three. So in the felt definition, we see 33.33% coming from men, 12.9% coming from women, 30% from the non-binary people, and 22.58% overall. So it's at the lowest rung there, and I think it should be noted just by the raw numbers that only 4 women agreed with this statement. Now, if it's true that this is the definition that protects women the most, wouldn't you expect more of them to agree with it? But no. As a matter of fact, everybody agreed at a higher rate in every gender category. More people agreed with the legal definition than any other, and it did achieve the highest rate overall. But it is of deep concern that we have this kind of split in the community, because if you have people engaging with each other physically who believe that the other person believes the same thing they do about consent and what it is and how it works, then and people with different expectations are trying to make it work, that's a recipe for disaster. So from now on, it's probably for the best if you check in with your partner beforehand to make sure which of these 3 definitions they're operating on, and whether or not you actually want to play with them, whether or not that's a consent model that you're willing to accept for yourself. Because if you don't want to play under those consent definitions, you shouldn't play, because that's not consensual either. Either level it out to something that you can both agree to, or just don't play. It's that simple. And, that there's other fish in the sea. Go back out there and find somebody that does want the same thing that you want. And so, a lot more could be said about this subject, and it's all in the study, of course. But the most selected response was that people preferred the legal definition of consent, which is a consent violation occurs when someone tells you no, and you don't stop, or you do it anyway, or when the person is clearly incapable of saying no. So there you are. There's your answer.